The Beatles were an English four-piece rock band, formed in Liverpool in 1960. Today we will discuss the story of how they went from playing in small clubs in Liverpool to becoming one of the most iconic and influential bands in music history. In July 6, 1957, 16-year-old John Lennon meets 15-year-old Paul McCartney at a church garden party. Lennon's band The Quarrymen had just played a set, and Paul had been impressed enough to come up to chat with him. As it turns out, McCartney was a musician, too, and performed a song for Lennon backstage. Lennon was also impressed, and asked McCartney to join the group as a rhythm guitarist. McCartney said yes. The two quickly got along due to their shared love for American rock and roll. In February 1958, McCartney invited his buddy George Harrison to watch the band. Harrison loved what he saw, and also wanted in. After impressing the band with his amazing guitar skills, they enlisted him as lead guitarist. By January 1959, Lennon's buddies who had formed the original band were out of the picture, and it was just him, Paul, and George. They continued to perform, though, sometimes performing as Johnny and the Moondogs. Whenever they could find a random drummer, they would play a show. Meanwhile, Lennon had begun studying at Liverpool College of Art, and there he met a dude named Stuart Sutcliffe. They became friends, and Sutcliffe joined the band on bass. He was actually the one who convinced the band to change their name to Beatles. Later they were the Silver Beatles, then the Silver Beatles, and then finally just the Beatles by August 1960. It was around this time that they got a residency in the famous red light district of Hamburg, West Germany. They also got a drummer, Pete Best. For the next 3.5 months, the now five-piece band played Lots House in Hamburg. Even though they were all back in Liverpool in early 1961, they'd be back to Hamburg several times over the next couple years. Around that time, Sutcliffe left the band to go back to school and pursue painting, and McCartney took over bass. Tragically, Sutcliffe would die from a brain hemorrhage the next year. Throughout 1961, the Beatles began to build up a following with the growing Merseybeat movement. A producer named Bert Kaempfer hired the Beatles, now a four-piece, to tour as Tony Sheridan's backing band for some recordings for Polydor Records. In November 1961, a local record store owner and music journalist named Brian Epstein first saw them perform and was extremely impressed. By January 1962, he was their manager, and was trying to get them out of their contract with Bert Kaempfer. By May, they were free of that contract, and Epstein had already been arranging auditions for the Beatles with new record labels. Epstein and the Beatles were rejected by Columbia Records, HMV, Pi Records, Philips Records, Oriole Records, and others. The band auditioned for Decca Records, who famously rejected them by telling Epstein that guitar groups are on the way out, and the Beatles have no future in show business. However, producer George Martin thought otherwise. He signed the band to EMI's Parlophone label. As the band began a recording session at EMI's Abbey Road studios in June 1962, Martin complained about Best's drumming, saying it wasn't the best. Ultimately, the Beatles had politely fired him from the band in August, replacing him with a dude named Richie Starkey, aka his stage name Ringo Starr, who had previously played drums for Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. The band recorded a few songs in September, and of those Martin chose the song, Love Me Do, to be their first single, releasing it on October 5, 1962. McCartney had actually originally written that song when he was 16, so yeah, the Beatles' first single was written before the Beatles even existed. Love Me Do was a success, peaking at number 17 on the record retailer chart. The band made their first television appearance on the regional news show People and Places. Before we continue our story, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Don't forget also to turn on the notification bell to be updated in our every uploads. Parlophone released their second single, Please Please Me, on January 11, 1963. This one was a bigger hit, reaching number 1 on both the New Musical Express and Melody Maker charts. On February 11, The Beatles recorded 10 songs in one day for the debut LP, also called Please Please Me, because it featured the hit single. Parlophone released the album on March 22, 1963. By May, Please Please Me had hit the top of the United Kingdom album charts, and stayed there for 30 weeks before being replaced by the next album. This is when Beatle Mania began. Beatle Mania describes the insane popularity the Beatles experienced over the next few years, typically symbolized by screaming teenage girls chasing them around. The bigger they got, the crazier the hysteria and high-pitched screaming by their mostly young fans. Though the album had no singles, it was even more critically acclaimed than the debut album, and also featured Harrison's first recorded solo composition. This was the album that described them as the "fabulous foursome" in the liner notes. And thus, the Fab Four nickname was born. While the Beatles were huge in Europe, that success didn't quite translate to the United States. But that changed with their single, I Want to Hold Your Hand, which Capitol Records released in the United States the day after Christmas of 1963. The song was the band's first American #1 hit. The Beatles made their American television debut on The Ed Sullivan Show to a screaming, wild crowd. It was on February 9, 1964. They are one of the most famous television performances in history. Around 73 million people, or around 45% of all American television viewers, saw the live performance. The label also quickly released the Beatles' Long Tall Sally exclusively in Canada. All of these thrown together albums were hugely successful. By April, the Beatles had 14 songs on Billboard's Hot 100 Singles chart all at once. Around that time, United Artists Records gave the Beatles a deal to make 3 movies. The first movie was a musical comedy based off what they were really experiencing called A Hard Day's Night, and was a smash hit, of course. The soundtrack for the film was officially their third studio album, released on July 10, 1964. The band toured heavily that summer, playing 37 shows over 27 days around the world. In August, the Beatles began a big tour of North America. It was on that tour they got to meet Bob Dylan, and he introduced them to his friend Cannabis. Dylan ended up having a big influence on the band's later music. On December 4, Parlophone released Beatles For Sale, their 4th studio album. In April 1965, John Lennon and his wife Cynthia and George Harrison and his girlfriend Pattie Boyd were hanging out with George's dentist, John Riley. Riley apparently secretly added LSD to their coffee. Boy, was that a surprise trip for the bunch. Regardless, after this Lennon and Harrison would be regular users of the drug, and later Starr and McCartney also tried it with them. On June 14 of that year, Capitol Records released another compilation to continue cashing in North America called Beatles 6, even though it was their 7th Beatles release. That same month, Queen Elizabeth sparked controversy by appointing all 4 Beatles members of the Order of the British Empire. Later that summer, the band starred in their 2nd film. The soundtrack to that film would be their 5th studio album, released on August 6, 1965. The movie was another comedy that followed the group as they struggled to record a new album, all while logically protecting Ringo from a cult and a pair of mad scientists. The band toured regularly promoting the album, playing one of their most famous shows on August 15 at New York's Shea Stadium to a record crowd of 55,600 people. In October, George Martin and the band decided that, instead of just making albums that were really just a collection of singles, they were going to focus on making a complete album. Also, for the first time in their entire careers, they were able to take their time recording, free of tour, radio, or film commitments. The result was a masterpiece, Rubber Soul, their 6th studio album released on December 3, 1965. Beyond music, the Beatles had a profound cultural impact. They were at the forefront of the 1960s counterculture, influencing fashion, art, and social attitudes. Their association with transcendental meditation and interest in Eastern spirituality also added to their cultural significance. The Beatles' career came to an end in 1970. Internal tensions, artistic differences, and personal issues led to their breakup. McCartney publicly announced his departure in April 1970, and the band officially dissolved. After the breakup, each member pursued a solo career. All four achieved success in their individual endeavors, with McCartney and Lennon becoming particularly successful solo artists. The Beatles' legacy is immeasurable. They revolutionized popular music, leaving an indelible mark on the industry. Their influence is still felt today, and their catalogue remains among the most celebrated and best-selling in music history. In the 1990s, the surviving members and the estates of Lennon and Harrison collaborated on The Beatles Anthology, a multimedia project that included a documentary series, albums, and a book. The anthology provided insights into the band's history with unreleased recordings and interviews. The Beatles' impact on music and culture is enduring, and their songs continue to be loved by new generations of fans around the world. And that's the wrap of our story for today. Thank you guys for watching. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel, and also please press the notification bell to be updated in our every uploads.